Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. It's time for the RetroStream. I'm here with a good friend, Brian Niemeier. You can find links to all his stuff down in the show notes, including his Patreon, my Patreon as well, and his new Indiegogo for the Burned Book, which is a prelude series, I think, to the Soul Cycle series that you've already come out with and won a Dragon Award for.
Yeah, that's correct. And it looks a lot like the lava lamp just over your shoulder, especially when I backlight the trophy.
Yeah, I need to put something else here. I have I have some of Jesse White's artwork, which he's got like a Indiegogo going right now with Kirsova. I think they're closing up in a couple days. But he's a really, really awesome artist. If you've never seen any of his stuff, it's great. So I have a couple of his original, this is an original page from a comic book he did with John Della Rose. So that's always cool. I need to put something else here. I have like a good 80s guitar I could put there. And by the way, 80s guitars didn't, we had this idea that 80s guitars looked like, I don't know what, like crazy, like metal stuff. And that's kind of true, but it's also what I think of the 80s more for like guitars is something like this. Like this is an 80s guitar right here. You may not think of it as an 80s guitar, but it's definitely an 80s guitar with like this color scheme. I still have the plastic on this pickguard, but like the red and white, these like very clean colors that they did in the 80s for like guitars and just everything else too. If you were buying new stuff, it was either like the wood grain stuff from the 70s or it was like the white stuff. And then in the 90s, it went to all the black. All the stereo systems magically transformed from silver and wood grain into just black Sony, the black Sony design language, I guess. Just kind of interesting. But yeah, I think of something like this as an actual 80s guitar and not, I have other guitars that have like wackier designs, but back in the 80s, people just continued using the stuff from before, and just made it a little more what they were doing. Most of my favorite guys from the 80s still played Stratocasters. It wasn't until the really late 80s that you had stuff like the Ibanez JEM, which Steve Vai played, really start to take hold and command, I guess, the aesthetic values of the music equipment people were using. But for the most part, like even if you look at pictures of Metallica, they're playing like fake Gibson guitars, and it's all old designs. It's not like extreme.
It's definitely not the pink Barbie Strat that John Mayer is playing in Last Train Home video. Have you seen it?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's that stuff around, but even when you pick up like a Kramer guitar from the 80s, first of all, they're always super heavy. I don't know why it is, but their Kramer guitars from the 80s were just like, they're like logs every time I find one. And you realize like, oh, it's just a Strat, but they put like a marble paint on it. It wasn't like, oh, it's pink. It's like, oh, they like put paint on marbles and like rolled the marbles all over the body, and that's how they got the paint job. And like crackle finishes and stuff. That's what was big in the 80s, not like even though like on the screen we have like the color pink, and blue. I think that's more kind of what I call retrovision. I did an article on this. Kind of, we encapsulate a time and we remember it sort of correctly, but we have to kind of push some things out of our idea of what a decade happened to be. And so for whatever reason, we ended up with like neon colors as like an extension of the 80s. Really like 1988 to 89 being like, that's what the 80s are. Combined with Tron, which is like the background of the video right now. It's like Tron. It's hard to underestimate how big an influence aesthetically Tron was.
Yeah, which is weird because it was considered kind of a failure at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it's one of those Apollo 13 successful failures that went on to really influence the culture after the fact.
Yeah. they had a joke about it in The Simpsons too. It's like, "Where are you, Homer?" And it was like they had this Simpsons Halloween special where they rendered him in 3D, where he escaped into the third dimension. And it's like, "Where are you, Homer?" He's like, "Have you guys ever seen the movie Tron?" And they're all like, "No, no, no, no. Yeah. Oh, I mean, no." Like, no one had seen
it's
Tron.
Like the whole town. Yeah. In his living room.
Yeah. So, but it's somehow by the end of the 80s, that aesthetic language had ended up taking over. And I think you can see it now. As weird as it is, I like to bring this up. And maybe I'm going to set this up and maybe find some images for us to look at. It's one of the worst album covers of all time.
I think I know what this is going to be.
Yeah, but it is so 80s. It's hard to not see what they were going for. And it's the album 90125 by Yes. Yes, of course, is a band that is really from the 70s. They're more known as like a 70s prog rock band. Anyway, here's what the cover looks like. And if you look at it, it's like, what was this made on? It's like, it was actually made on an Apple II, which was the point of the band. Now, I realize my face is covering this up a little bit. So I'll switch me over here. And you can see wasn't actually covering anything up. It's a mute gray. It's a squished pie chart with the number of the name of the album, which is just the catalog number for the album. And a stylized Y, I guess, is what that makes here. And some rather interesting, like CGA colors from 1983. This album came out, I believe, in 1983. And believe it or not, set the tone for the 80s in a way that I think if you were in 1983, it wouldn't have made any sense. It only makes sense after the fact where you're like, oh, like this was the 80s music aesthetic. This was the 80s design aesthetic in its like, I don't know, larval stage. You know, it hadn't yet fully matured. I think Tron was Tron 1983 or 1982?
I
1982.
Say, yeah.
1982. Okay. So yeah, kind of all around the same time as this sort of stuff. It looks awful. What do you think? They did
it's a festival of gray.
Yeah.
With the 3-color highlight there. It's not even RGB. It's like kind of...
Yeah, it's like CGA. So CGA graphics, if you guys remember those, like you had to get really used to like colors like neon green and magenta because they couldn't produce even 16 colors. It was like an 8-color thing. And the colors, I don't know why they ended up with the colors that they did on CGA, but they're very harsh. If you ever go back and play a CGA game like Commander Keen from the 80s in CGA, it's I don't know what the word is. It's rather harsh on the eyes with all the like bright pink. Maybe that's why we think a little bit of like pink being an 80s color is because CGA, that was the main color. You didn't have red, you had pink. You had that like, what is that color? Like a fuchsia almost. The color of like this color, this like purple pink. So it's kind of interesting to think about. But if you also listen to this album, the producer for this was a guy named Trevor Horn, who was a vocalist for Yes. After, oh my gosh, I just forgot the name of the vocalist from Yes. Anderson. After he quit the band, Trent Horn was the vocalist in the late 70s. Band actually broke up. This was not supposed to be a Yes album. It was supposed to be a new band called Cinema. But by the time that Chris Squire and the Trevor Rabin, the new Trent, was it Trent Horn? Trevor Horn. No, Trevor Horn. Yeah, Trevor Horn was the producer. But you had a guitar player named Rabin who joined the band. By the time they finished filling out the personnel for the album, it was just Yes. It was just the band Yes again. You know, it was Anderson and Squire. They had the original keyboard player back in the band. It was the entire band minus Steve Howe, the guitar player who had formed the band Asia, the other major band to release an album in 1983 that shaped the way the 80s sounded for the rest of the decade. So if you listen to
the legendary supergroup,
yeah, Asia was a great group, man. And you look at it, you're like, oh, it's so 80s. It's like this was a bunch of early 70s prog rock guys who got together and they're like, rather than writing 20-minute long songs, they're like, what if we just made our songs 5 minutes long? And it's like #1 hit record. Like that's how good these guys were. They were fantastic musicians. There's a reason these albums got to be so popular is that they had all of the, I guess, good ideas that you would get in a prog rock album, like weird creative stuff, weird time signatures through this album too. Thinking of it as a pop album, when you hear like all of a sudden like lots of mixed meters throughout the album. But they were able to just tighten it up, write things that are a little bit more accessible and short enough that they could be on the radio, and all of a sudden you have a #1 hit record. Isn't that wild?
Okay, so Asia or Traveling Wilburys? Choose your supergroup.
I think, well, it depends. If you're just going by that first Asia record, I'll take Asia. But the Traveling Wilburys were again another one of these things where it's like, yeah, that's an 80s thing, but you listen to it and it sounds like it's really from the 60s.
Yeah.
Who was in it? Tom Petty? Tom Petty was in it.
Yeah, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, George Harrison.
That's right. Yeah. So it was really a super group of guys from the 70s and 60s that were able to get back together. This was a thing about the 80s too, that I talked about this with Jesse White when he was on. I need to have him on for one of these retro streams because I feel like he would have so much to say about this kind of stuff. But there was not this, I don't know what to call it, like an obsession with youth that, I don't know, exploded in the 90s. I feel like 90s, everything was like, if the band members were older than 27, forget about it. They're not getting on the radio. Every band was really young. That wasn't the case in the 80s. You had a lot of experienced bands like Traveling Wilburys, but also bands like Dire Straits. Stevie Ray Vaughan, by the time he hit the scene, had been playing professionally for a decade, and just kind of got his big break after gigging for a long time. These guys weren't inexperienced musicians. Even the Beatles, who we think of as young, they spent a whole year playing in Germany, like 3 gigs a night or something. They got really good at what they were doing. I think it's only post Nirvana, this idea like everybody has to be young to do it. I think Soundgarden was accidentally a hit in the 90s because they were going with the Seattle sound. They wanted Seattle bands. So they were like, well, Soundgarden's also from Seattle and they're kind of popular. It's like, well, they really predate the entire grunge thing. They're from the mid 80s. They're a mid 80s band and then just got their break in the 90s for whatever, I think because of kind of rising on the tide of Kurt Cobain's popularity.
Well, about the youth obsession thing, so of course the common wisdom is that MTV and music video came around and just killed anyone who didn't have like looks verging on a supermodel or could be made up to look like it. Like great example is Toto.
Oh, right? Yeah.
Some musicians, like each member of the band was like, there were these legendary session musicians, studio musicians that came together. Like for those of you guys who don't know this trivia out there, Toto were the band on Michael Jackson's Thriller. Mm-hmm. But they looked like bricklayers. Yeah, here's a picture of them.
They were like absolutely outstanding musicians, like some of the best guys in the business, and they had tons of work. But yeah, like look at Trevor Horn. This guy fronted Yes. This guy was the front man for Yes. It just, I don't know. You were able to do that. You were able to just like be a famous musician and not even really look that good, or be kind of, have the glasses, the big thick reading glasses that you have to wear. this guy created the sound of the 80s as far as production goes. A lot of people are looking for an 80s guitar sound. They're like, we're going to add chorus and reverb to it. It's like, what you need to listen to is the way that the songs were actually produced. It was all about that hyper clean production where every instrument is super separated, very audible. You can hear it with Rush. I think Rush, Moving Pictures by Rush, which came out in 1980, was very formative of the sound. But really, it was like by the time you got to Power Windows in 1986, you can hear the 80s on that record. Really clean production, really audible separation between all the guitar parts, and just very clean, pure tone for guitar and bass. Not that wall of sound that you had from the 70s. It's a hard thing to explain to people who aren't musicians, but once you hear it with that in mind, like, oh, I could tell this is from the 80s because every instrument is really easy to hear. It sounds almost, I don't know what the word is, kind of spatial. Like you're hearing them separately rather than together. And that was just the trend. And Trevor Horn was a big part of that. But yeah, you can't underrate. Toto also did the soundtrack for Dune.
Yeah.
And did a really good job with it. You don't think like, oh, it's a pop band doing a soundtrack. And then you hear Dune, you're like, man, these guys were good. Like they had range. They could really create some strange sounds. It was really kind of perfect for that 80s vision of Dune, because you had a lot of electronic sounds that they were just able to do because they knew their equipment. A big part of making music in the 70s and 80s was knowing how to operate complex equipment. Compared to the 60s where you plugged into an amp and you just kind of played. In the 70s, you had these complex Moog synthesizers. The sound of the 80s is the Yamaha DX7, DX10. These are really popular FM keyboards. But you had to have a little know-how to like really get them to work properly. And of course, big effects boards, Frippatronic stuff. So Robert Fripp from King Crimson, again, a 70s influence. By the time you get to the 80s, this idea of like big, crazy guitar effects, all of that was knowing how to set up a signal with your guitar and make some really strange sounds with it. And they did a really good job with it in the Dune soundtrack, I felt like.
It's hard to believe that Robert Fripp's first music teacher told him he was tone and rhythm deaf and he would never play. One of history's biggest VTFOs.
I think there's a similar story with Elvis, where like his choir teacher said he was tone deaf or he would never amount to anything. I think especially music history is kind of littered with these examples. Beethoven was told he would never, be anything. He wasn't good enough as a child. Of course, Debussy was told that he lacked the technical proficiency to ever succeed as a piano player, and he radically changed the course of classical music. Really not by being a technical player, but by doing things no one else had done before, by thinking outside the box. I think there's a lot of players that are like that. Frippatronics is, I'm hesitant to say like what my musical influences are, because I say them and I'm like, I'm super influenced by Yes. And they're like, but your music sounds nothing like Yes. I'm like, I know it doesn't. I'm aware of that. Just like, this is the things that I hear and I love are the sounds of Yes and like King Crimson and Rush.
Yeah. You use new standard tuning.
Yeah. I do a lot of weird tunings now, but a lot of it, like if you listen to the newest Zool album, which is called Return, everything in it is E standard tuning. I didn't do anything out of the box for the tuning. I just kind of focused on using effects and looping and melodies in a creative way instead of trying to do weird tunings and all that kind of stuff. It's hard to, it's weird to think too, like one of the abstractions we get out of the 80s is like heavy metal.
Yeah.
And heavy metal was popular. Heavy metal was consistently popular for almost 40 years. The biggest records of the 90s were metal records. And a lot of the big records of the 80s were metal records, but not all of them. And really metal was still, even in the 1980s, was still, it was like the big side thing. Like it wasn't pop music. It was popular but it was like this slightly off the path popular, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, like kind of the biggest subculture.
Yeah, the biggest subculture. Same thing with punk, and this is a weird thing to think about too. Is like, bands like Blondie started out as punk bands in the 70s. What punk was, and not what it would become by the 80s. This is another one of those retrovision things that I think is just its own thing to talk about. I bet you J.D. Cowan would have a lot to say about it too, which is really that people's idea of punk is this early to mid 80s popular punk thing, or it's the late 90s pop punk aesthetic, which is itself kind of derivative and I don't know, an abstraction of what punk was in the 80s. And punk as an approach, and certainly as a I don't know, politically minded thing, has been off the rails and irrelevant for almost since its inception. It's stepped away from its own self right away, especially with something like the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, like and they were put together by a British record store owner, just like as a sales gimmick.
Mm-hmm.
But if you listen to the Dead Kennedys, I think it's on Bedtime for Democracy. But yeah, right around the era we're talking about, like early 80s, there's a song in which Joel Biafra sings, "Punk's not dead, it just deserves to die," and it becomes another stale cartoon. Like, the originators of the movement already saw that it was getting commercialized and kind of getting warped into this retrovision caricature. Because yeah, everybody thinks of the 80s and 80s punk, and they think of Sex Pistols, they think a guy with Liberty Spikes and a clothespin in his nose. But no, it was like the Ramones and Blondie.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, the Ramones were, and this was a funny thing too. Is like, was it Johnny Rotten? Johnny Rotten came out and endorsed Donald Trump, and that all of a sudden a bunch of the punk people got all upset about that. I'm like, Donald Trump, even though he's a billionaire, is like the most punk president, and that he's outside the system. But by the time he said that, by 2016, punk had been completely co-opted by statist leftists. They'd say things about anarchy, but they weren't actually interested in anarchy not remotely. I remember having a conversation with someone who's like, "You don't know what anarchy is." I'm like, "I know exactly what anarchy is. I know what the word means, and I know what people meant about it. What you're conjuring up is somehow the anarchy stage after communism is what you're imagining. What Karl Marx thought would emerge would be a classless, stateless society." Okay, you can believe in that if you want to.
Farm in the morning and go fishing in the afternoon. And,
yeah. Oh, when after the socialist revolution, I'm going to spend my time educating children. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to be working in the salt mines, or you're going to face the wall because you haven't studied how socialism works.
The Wall. There's another great progressive rock album.
Somebody has to do the work for his fellow man, right? You don't get to just like, I'll be the teacher after the communist revolution. It's like, you'll probably be the person who cleans the toilets because they'll decide that somebody who's better than you will be the teacher, or somebody who has a better connection, or you're too bourgeois and you're going to go into the fields and the farmer's going to come in and be the surgeon, like what they did in Cambodia. Anyway, not to get too political on that, but it's one of those funny things with punk is that it just kind of became a bourgeois leftist. I don't know what. Yeah, especially by the 2000s, it was just bourgeois leftism.
Just affectation. Yeah. Well, it had no natural immunity from leftism because leftists' ethos always requires them to be the underdog, right? They're always the scrappy young upstart, like fighting against the man, even when they are the man. And like the 90s is when they started to become the man, and there was a big like indie music scene punk resurgence around that time. So, like, all right, well, we'll wear this as a skin suit, and we can like move our fists in the air and like just hurl invectives at Bush, both of them, and call ourselves punks, right? But like wear a Misfits jacket and yeah.
It's really funny because, like, if you think of the Misfits as a punk band, right? None of those guys really kept playing punk after like 1983. So
You said that for anybody, yeah.
there, it's like, well, what happened to Glenn Danzig? Well, he went into Samhain, which was like a thrash metal band. Oh, and what happened to the rest of the guys? Well, they started a Christian metal band called Christ the Conqueror. What? What? Like, that's weird. Jerry Only and Doyle had a Christian metal band? Yeah, and then, Danzig just ended up playing metal. Like, they didn't stick with punk. Like, they didn't uphold punk as some sort of virtue. Like, punk was just like, no, we're just doing our own thing. That was the way that they thought about it. And so, yeah, they didn't. And Kurt Cobain thought of his band as a punk band, by the way. Why? Well, because they were an indie rock band, right? Just doing their own thing, being harsh, kind of do-it-yourself mentality, and being independent. And so, like, I don't know what to call, like, taking Nirvana, the indie rock band, and being like, okay, now you're the biggest rock band on earth because we said so. I don't know what to call that, like an uplift. Like, they just picked him up, and it just, I don't love Kurt Cobain as like a musician, but I feel sorry for him because he obviously could not handle something like that, and it didn't make sense to him.
Yeah.
And he knew it was artificial.
No, on the other hand, Dave Grohl is a good musician, and he agreed. There's this anecdote from the ZTV tour when Nirvana opened for U2, like playing stadiums, and Dave Grohl's having this conversation with Bono backstage, and Bono's like, yeah, this grunge thing is really interesting. I don't really know what to make of it. And Grohl just kept insisting, no, man, we're just a punk band. No, man, we're just a punk band. Just kept reflecting all the hype. And yeah, if the two lead guys in Nirvana insisted until the day the band ended that they were a punk band, they were probably a punk band.
Yeah. Yeah, but punk is playing like these three chords and like emulating the Ramones and the Misfits, even though we would probably hate their politics, things like that. And Greg Ginn from Black Flag. I mean, the father of the hardcore punk aesthetic and movement is a Trump guy and endorsed Trump, and like.
Friendship ended with Henry Rollins.
Yeah, Greg Ginn. That was Greg Ginn, and he got. They wanted to blacklist Greg Ginn. He's like, you can't blacklist somebody who refuses to be popular. Like it just doesn't work, right? Like there's nothing you can. It's like I'm trying to remember what Greg said about it. He's like, there's nothing you can hold over my head when I'm like choosing not to be a millionaire. Like what are you gonna do? Take away money I don't have? It doesn't work that way. I don't care about that.
Oh, and JD has entered the chat.
Yeah.
You summoned him as Eve.
Yeah.
Nice.
The moment punk became pop shattered the scene itself. Yeah. And I remember I was in like a punk band in the early 2000s, and this was like the I guess the ideological conflict within the band was, like what is punk? Because the biggest punk bands are like Blink-182 and Sum 41 and SR-71. SR something like that. There was these numbered punk bands. I don't know why they all had numbers, but they did. And you listen to them, and what they did was they took the sort of the format of early 80s punk music, specifically like Ramones and Misfits, early Misfits, not like 1983 Earth AD hardcore Misfits. Like I remember putting Earth AD on for like one of the guys that was in my band, and he's like, this is the Misfits? I'm like, yeah. He's like, this is like extreme metal. It's like they didn't pause to think about what punk sounded like in 1983. They just kept making music until the band fell apart, and then Glenn Danzig kept making music under a different band that kept going in a different direction, whatever he felt like doing. Danzig was an industrial band in the mid-90s. A lot of people don't remember that phase. They're like, oh, Danzig has this like classic rock sound. It's like, well, it depends, you know.
But what people want to say and how they want to say it changes.
Yeah. And Motorhead considered themselves a punk band for a long time. They're like, I guess we're metal because everyone says we are, but we didn't really consider ourselves heavy metal. We were more like a punk rock band. And we just wanted to play fast, high-powered rock and roll and, you know, and drink. that was what Motorhead was.
I think we're kind of feeling our way around the elephant in the room, which is that grunge didn't exist.
Yeah.
How about that? I'm going to throw that up there.
Yeah, there's no such thing as grunge. That's a really good point. Maybe we can elaborate on that.
I'm sure I find the first shot, I'll get the ball rolling. Yeah, and what I mean by that isn't as a marketing signifier or a brand. Okay, it did in the Madison Avenue sense, but in terms of a musical movement like punk or like metal or like prog rock, you cannot pick any sampling of what were called grunge bands and say in any meaningful sense that these guys like compose or perform music in the same genre. And I can think of one objection David might come up with, which is, oh, well, define jazz. But no, I think this transcends that because we can name what genres they are. Like you were saying, right?
Yeah. So the thing about like define jazz is such a good one because I've met so many jazz musicians that are like, well, what defines jazz is the improvisational element. They're like, what is the most robust definition? It's like, it's a band that's improvising. That's what jazz is. If there's no improvisation, it's not jazz. And so then you have to ask the question, well, what do you think about Benny Goodman in the 1940s? They played all the canned solos and they're like, it sounds like jazz, but it's not jazz. I'm like, but that's kind of a problem, right? You know, because we're identifying what the methodology for creating the music is. That doesn't mean a listener can hear it and identify what it is. Do you know what I mean? It's a really hard thing to nail down, like, what is jazz? Because I could play like Bitches Brew and then I could play Birth of the Cool and you'd be like, well, these are both jazz by the same musician. And you'd be like, they can't be the same genre. They just can't be. You know, they sound nothing alike. One sounds one sounds like insane drugged out nonsense and the other one sounds like, well, jazz, you know. So that's a tough one.
Speaking of insane drugged out nonsense, yeah, like we were talking about with grunge and JD's mentioning in chat that it was a fashion they were trying to sell after like glam and hair metal were aged out for being too expensive for record companies. Yeah,
that's basically that. And like you look at it, like I'll show you, like this is a retrovision image right here of grunge. It's like, this was the fashion of the 1990s. It's like, no one looked like this. You know, I did this on the article and maybe I can pull it up here in a minute. It was like you know, no one looked like this. So you go into like an AI art gen, like no one looked like this in the 90s. No one. This is like a joke, right? It has to be a joke. This has to be from like a comedy. This looks like a 90s comedy movie with like the chain wallet. I had a chain wallet, but not till like 1998. You know, no one looked like this. Not a single person. What were people wearing? T-shirts and jeans. And mostly clothes that fit.
Yeah, that's really been the uniform of like suburban America since the early 80s, late 70s. I mean, we talked about the cultural ground zero effect for a while, but pretty much anyone from today could hop in a time machine, just dressed as he is, and go back any time in the last 40 years, and no one's going to bat an eye.
Yeah, no one would really care if I wore what I was wearing now and went back to 1986. They'd be like, well, that guy's wearing gym shorts and a t-shirt. It's a really silly t-shirt. I wonder where he got it.
Yeah.
And sneakers. you know, and he has long hair. Maybe he just has really long hair or something. You'd have to go back to like the 50s before long hair would look truly weird. Maybe the early 60s, you know?
Yeah. Oh, that's another great springboard, because it doesn't just stop at the 80s like you're talking about. I don't know why this drift effect happens with retrovision, but every decade seems to become associated with the fashions of like either its last couple of years or the first couple of years of the next decade.
Yep.
So what am I talking about? Most of the 60s was dudes in three-piece suits and hats and horn-rimmed glasses, and it looked like what we think of as the 50s. It was like Father Knows Best. And it wasn't until like 68 that you get like the hippie trends.
Mm-hmm. I call it the 3-year myth, which is like for 3 years, this was what this was what all the fashion, you know, the music magazines from like 67 to 1970, this was what people thought the fashion was supposed to be. And then as the years go by, people think, well, that's what the 60s look like. Well, up here is what an AI thinks the 1960s look like, based on it looking at 1960s photos. And when I look at pictures of my dad or my mom from the 60s, this is what the photos look like. It's like the girls are wearing, you know, normal fitting dresses. The boys are wearing like slacks and, you know, jackets which fit them. They don't have long hair. They have normal haircuts, right? Like people look pretty normal, you know, for the most part. In order for me to get the AI to draw hippies, I have to ask them to draw hippies, or like plug in words like Woodstock. Otherwise, it won't associate them with the 60s at all, because it's looking at things that were from the 60s to determine what 1960s means. It doesn't have our little encapsulated retrovision bias. But even then, hippies probably didn't look like this. This is an abstraction of what we think hippies looked like. If you went to Woodstock, most people were probably still dressed in normal clothes, for the most part, you know, and the bell bottoms, and that was probably a minority. But if you're there filming, what do you film? You film the people who are weird. It's like, here's all these weird pictures from Woodstock. It was probably so wild. I remember talking to someone who was at Woodstock. He's like, yeah, it was really awful. It was like hot. There was no water, you know, it was raining. Like, it was just this really miserable time. It's like, what about all the naked people? It's like, I don't know. I don't remember that, you know? It's like, I remember I couldn't hear the music and it was really miserable.
That live audio always sucked.
Yeah. And live audio in the 60s was bad, especially outdoors. Like an outdoor stage, there was nothing with enough power to play to a large crowd outside. You had to, you know, it's kind of like you see maybe photos like there's a bunch of microphones, like someone comes up and there's like 100 microphones. It's because in order to be loud, you had to run a bunch of PAs, and you couldn't just parallel a bunch of PAs together because you would lose signal because of the way that everything was designed back then. Nothing was designed for a crowd of 20,000. Things were designed for indoor spaces of a couple hundred. So you had to have a bunch of things kind of separately. So you'd see like 5 mics on Jimi Hendrix's amp going to 5 separate PAs to try to produce the sound. It probably sounded really awful because each of those had a different mix going on. You know, it wasn't until the 1970s when they got really powerful PAs that you started to get good, loud live rock sound. And of course, now it's probably too loud. I go to a venue now and it's like you'll lose your hearing. They make the PAs so loud now.
Yeah, that has happened to me more than once. Oh, okay. They're asking to see the 70s.
Here's the 70s. Yeah. So here's
AI.
Yeah. Here's the 70s. So did the 70s look like this? Kind of. This is very retrovision though, because this looks like 70s catalogs. Catalogs became a really big thing in the 70s. For whatever reason, people liked all their little magazines and catalogs. And so what's the catalog going to show you? It's going to show you the ideas of what the current interior fashions are and what the current personal fashions are. So like there's these women with glasses, and I'm not sure what's about them. You know, my mom doesn't really look like this from the 70s, a little bit. Like maybe the hair is pretty 70s. But they're showing an interior that you might see, and this is like a model pose, right? Like somebody in a catalog would look like this. Likewise, like no one sat around in clothes like this. This was like maybe from a fashion catalog. You have these women over here. This looks kind of 70s, but you notice things aren't quite lining up. The couches are pretty accurate, I'd say. Those look like 70s couches to me. We had a couple.
The 70s is kind of the exception that proves the rule for Retrovision. Like, people looked more like our conception of the 70s in the 70s than our conception of the 60s or the 80s or even the 90s. Like, for example, go find some old yearbooks and like look at the 77 through 79 yearbooks, and then like the 85 yearbook, and it's like a switch was thrown, and the 80s are just like back to kids looking normal. Like in the 70s you have these like lime green tuxedos with like frothy lace and cravats and stuff, and then the 80s it's like, nope, like senior photo back to a normal suit and tie, like a Yale tie and double-breasted suit and collegiate hair.
Yeah.
And you mentioned... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, JD Cowan says Woodstock 99 looks closer to the 2000s than the 90s. Anyway, keep going.
Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And I think it ties into, along with these catalog shots, because you're right, they totally are. Good Retrovision...
Yeah, my dad mostly wore like jeans in the 70s, most people did. I think that 70s show, even though it's like a Retrovision show, it's fairly accurate to how the late 70s looked. Like none of the clothes they wear is that outrageous. It's just a little bit like, okay, the pants kind of fit like this. The shirts fit on the actors. They wear a lot of t-shirts, right? T-shirts have been the popular thing since the 60s, so.
Yeah, so do you think that Retrovision is derived from Madison Avenue marketing, and the reason it's gotten so effective at kind of retroactively causing this weird substitute amnesia, or these memory implants, if you will, is the Retrovision effect tracks with the spread of mass media and first television and then the internet.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I would say like the mass media has to have something to do with it. We grew up seeing all these like documentaries on Woodstock and why it was the most important thing in the history of the world, and you start to incorporate that into a cultural outlook on it. It becomes a mythologized idea of the times that you were looking at. I think for other decades, though, you have this idea of a retro fashion, right? Which is like, oh, we're going to take this thing that's before and like bring it forward, and it's unique again, right? Like if you have big glasses, like the big glasses were a thing, I don't know, a while back. Like everyone started wearing like big glasses, and that was like the retro thing to do for a while. It's like in the year 2000, I was the only guy wearing these glasses. I could walk around and it'd be like, whoa, that guy, I was the only guy wearing glasses like this. If that's just how it was. Like people didn't wear them. They wore like the wraparounds. I think Cesar Campos said in the chat, like the 2000s really were about like frosted tips and baggy jeans. I can confirm that. Yeah, that was definitely a thing. But when people think of the 90s, they think of baggy pants. But baggy pants didn't really hit till the very end. And if I ask the AI to draw 90s stuff, it looks like this. This is what the 90s really looked like. It doesn't look that different from the 80s. Right? It's a little different. Yeah. There's a couple different styles. The 80s did look a lot like this. The malls probably weren't quite as white and nice as this. But there's a couple that are like that. I've been to a couple malls that kept that 80s look, and they still look cool to me. Disneyland stuff that they put out in the 80s has this kind of vibe going to it. But you notice people wearing like t-shirts and jeans and, sweaters and like normal stuff. And you go to the 90s and people are wearing t-shirts and jeans and jean jackets and, normal stuff. This red hair is a very early 90s thing, by the way. Both of these things. Like people, I don't know what it was, but like 1995 was the year of the red hair. 1995, everyone wanted to dye their hair like apple red to look cool. And I think part of it was that you were actually allowed to dye your hair red at school because people had red hair. So kids would always want to push the envelope for what they could have at school, like an earring and of course people in the 80s had earrings too, the red hair or, I had big mutton chops in the 90s because you weren't allowed to wear a beard to school. I was like, but there was no like rule on how big your sideburns could be. So I had like big, like metal mutton chops, big greaser mutton chops that were fun. But yeah, the 1990s kind of looked like this, other than the obvious AI things, but like the elements of it are more or less there. I had a leather jacket exactly like this in the 90s. In fact, I still have it. I can go get it from the other room. And I had a jean jacket just like this in the 90s. In fact, I still have it. I can go get it from the other room. Girls look like this.
Yeah, there's a story in that lower right one. That significant look there in the mall. But yeah. I'm a little behind the lag here.
Yeah.
So something that occurred to me while you're talking about this kind of 80s, 90s bleed over, and concurrent with this like Madison Avenue kind of memory holing and emphasizing whatever it chooses selectively idea, the whole concept of Gen Y, right? I mean, that undergirds this entire discussion. And as a kid, I remember growing up being told, yeah, okay, like the generation before us, like our older brothers and sisters, they're Gen X. And we're like Gen Y or maybe the MTV generation.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until my teens that the word millennial even came into popular use.
Yeah. And
it clearly meant kids younger than us.
Yeah, like the millennials, what are the millennials going to do when they graduate? And it's like, I already graduated. It's like, what do you mean? It's like, when they graduate in 10 years is what they meant. So they meant people that were born in the 90s, And so 80s kids, 90s kids, 70s kids, we all had a little bit different experience. The 70s kids were the latchkey generation. They went home from school alone. And this went all the way into the 80s because I remember this. And I talked to Jesse on the channel about it too. Is like you get out of school and like no one's around. Like the neighborhood's empty. All the parents went to work. Like I don't know what happened, but like the switch hit in 1978 and all the women went to work. So like, yeah, there was no one in the neighborhood. You just did whatever you wanted. You went home, unlocked your own house, went to your house alone and watched TV or did your homework or played a game or just did whatever you wanted to, I guess. You probably have like, chores that you had to do. And I had this I have J.D. Cowan's book, by the way, which you guys should check out.
Oh, yeah.
So where's this big one? There we go. Y Signal. So here's my physical copy of Y Signal. So you should check that out because this kind of crosses over with some of the stuff we're doing, but does it again in like a story format, fiction format. I have mine around here somewhere too. Oh yeah, Afterglow Generation Y, and of course me and Brian and JD Cowan JD Cowan put a book together called Generation Y: The New Lost Generation. I will actually link it right now because I have all my links handy. I have a whole giant folder, like bookmark folder, of all the book links that I've done, and it's whenever I feel like I'm not doing enough work, I go and look at all of my links. For like, here's all the stuff that I've done, which people can buy. And I'm like, I've done a lot, man. I put out a lot of stuff. If I feel like I'm being too lazy or like, I can't afford to take a break. It's like, nah, I've done a lot actually, Yep.
And speaking of links, once again, for those just joining us, you can find links to David's and my newest projects in the show notes, including our Patreons and Subscribe Stars, and my campaign for my first Soul Cycle prequel, The Burned Book, which is going on in Indiegogo. Right now, we are within spitting distance of our 4th stretch goal, and if we reach it, I have committed to reading the first chapter live on stream for backers only. So if you want to hear it, help make it happen, get your ticket to the show. It's going to be a ton of fun.
Yeah. So yeah, Brian's current Indiegogo, it's already met its goals. It's 485% over the goals. It's a prelude to the Soul Cycle. Correct?
It's a better word.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's book 1 in the Arkwright cycle. Yeah, which is the prelude to the award-winning Soul Cycle.
Yeah. So I actually I approve of this kind of prequelizing. When I think about my favorite, I hate the word prequel because I don't know. It just doesn't, it's appropriate for Star Wars. But I wrote if you guys read Kindle Vela, I need to pull it off of Vela, but I have a book called The Bright Children there that is a far in the distant past prelude to my other fantasy works. So I like stuff like that. I like stuff like Knights of the Old Republic, where it's like, instead of going 30 years back, we're going to go 2,000 years back. Then it's almost like, the connections, by being a little bit more separated, I think are more interesting. And you have a little bit less continuity issues as well. And making things fit together is a little easier.
Indeed, and that is what I did. And Knights of the Old Republic, like the old Dark Horse comics from the high 90s, were a major inspiration on Arkwright Cycle.
Yeah, I remember a lot of those, like the Star Wars comics and the Star Wars novels. I didn't read all of them. But I always liked some of the ideas that were there. It was kind of like an idea, an idea farming, an IP farm almost. There were so many different ideas that you could come out with. And because comics and books were so much cheaper to make than a movie, you could really try out a lot more different things and kind of see what stuck. There's a reason a lot of Hollywood movies are adaptations of already popular works, and that's because it's already been tried and tested. We already know that it's popular. We don't have to do a lot of thinking about it.
Yeah, it's funny how comics became this idea factory for projects and other media, like in the 80s and 90s, and now the corporate IP death cycle, which you have defined, took over, and now the comic book companies have just been captured by these media conglomerates, and they're only kept in publication to maintain IPs for these tentpole movies.
Yeah. And maybe to, sometimes parts of the story they use in parts of the MCU, but the MCU is mostly like an independent thing. And I remember kind of going back and forth with someone about this. It's like, they used this element in this movie that was after the year 2000. I'm like, but that's still Spider-Man. It's like, what about Miles Morales? I'm like, they called him Spider-Man, right? They're still just using the same stuff that they made up in the 60s. They're not really coming up with a lot of new things. I think the last superhero thing I saw, the newest one I've seen, as far as the creation of the character, was probably like Deadpool, and he was from the 80s, I think, maybe 90s. You have Cable. Cable was from the 90s. But the Deadpool movies. X-Men was a 1970s property. Iron Man's from the 60s. Thor's from the 60s. All these things are things that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee came up with in the 60s.
It's really hard to name the most recent comic book character, most recently created one, to break out onto the A-list and become a household name. Because comics just haven't had that much circulation, haven't had that much cultural cachet since the early 90s. I mean, the industry never recovered from the big collector bust in the 90s.
Yeah, and that, by the way, did coincide with Cultural Ground Zero. After looking into it, I was like, I remember the industry collapsing in the 90s. What happened? Well, everybody bought each other between 1995 and 1997, and I think Marvel went bankrupt in 1998. So, the comics industry suffered a massive collapse around 1997 and 1998, and it never recovered from it. The readership, if we compare the readership of Marvel Comics under Jim Shooter, who was fairly unpopular, right? Now, if you talk to a lot of comic fans now, they're like, Jim Shooter, bad, because the artists that they followed from the 90s had personal issues with Jim Shooter telling them what to do and not giving them enough royalties or something else. He actually paid his artists pretty well and gave them a lot of royalty deals and stuff. But Jim Shooter ran a tight ship and had a lot of conflicts with the artists. But during the 80s, under his leadership, they were selling 100,000 units of every title. It wasn't 100,000 books total. Every single book was 100,000. Every X-Men shipped 100,000 books every month. And that was just one title of all of their titles. They were all pulling, an order of magnitude more. Every title was doing an order of magnitude more in the 80s. So when you watch something, this reminds me, you watch something like a Kevin Smith movie from the 90s or 2000s, where comics are featured in it, right? It's a Gen X movie. Kevin Smith represents the Gen X perspective to me. You have these guys who are obsessed with comics. So they draw comics like in Chasing Amy. It's really funny because if you watch Chasing Amy and you see these comic artists, it's like that movie's totally out of time when it was released. Comics were basically already dead. When did Chasing Amy come out? I don't know if anyone knows off the top. Chasing Amy. 1997. Cultural Ground Zero.
Oh, there it is. Every time.
1997. By the time it came out, the comics industry had already completely collapsed and no one read comics anymore. That is so wild. Yeah. Marvel went bankrupt in 1996.
Yeah, close enough for punk rock.
Yeah. Yep, yeah. 1997. JD was right. But yeah, that kind of Gen X obsession with comics, that's from the 80s. Comics were big. And just to provide a little balance on Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter had this big idea of this massive shared soap opera universe, basically, called the New Universe, and it was a big flop. And that probably contributed to his being fired from Marvel more than any of the conflicts with the artists, but rather this. He had the idea for the MCU, but all new stuff. That was his idea. We're going to build it from the ground up as a shared universe rather than the hodgepodge way that they had done it beforehand, which is crossovers that don't really make sense. It's we're going to do, he had the MCU before the MCU was a thing. But they didn't reuse the heroes. They came up with new stuff, and it was a big flop.
Yeah. And you know what pretext they actually fired him on?
I don't remember.
Got him. Okay. So, you mentioned Jack Kirby earlier. Well, what some of our listeners might not know is that when you draw for one of the big two, they own your art.
Yep.
But
it's work for hire.
Yep. However, if you could get big enough, if you're an A-lister, you could get a clause in your contract that said that, okay, after so many years, the rights to your drawings revert to you, and the company has to return your original art to you. And Kirby, of course, was big enough to have that deal with Marvel. Well, that stipulated time elapsed in his contract. Now, he was already dead, unfortunately, I believe at the time, but his widow came representing his estate and went to Marvel and said, okay, well, I need Jack's original drawings back now. And this coincided with Shooter being editor-in-chief of Marvel at the time. And he hadn't been, like, when the deal was signed or anything, he was just left holding the buck, right? Well, so like send this editorial intern down to go look for his art, and it was gone. Like, there were tons of pieces of it just missing, and Marvel just couldn't account for it. Like, I'd have to look into it, but I think to this day they don't know where that art went, and they used it as an excuse to fire Shooter, that he lost Jack Kirby's art, and I think there was this big lawsuit with his estate. But it was just an excuse, really. It was a pretext to get rid of him. And the lore goes that John Byrne went around the office whistling "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead" the day Shooter was fired.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there was a... Man, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that story. But that's interesting to think about. I know that there was like always this conflict with talent, basically, and I looked into it, and it's like Jim Shooter told people what to do, and he made them finish their books on time. And as soon as he was gone, what happened? Like, books stopped being shipped on time and finished on time, and the stories just went completely off the rails in the 90s. I don't know if anybody remembers how bad Spider-Man comics started to get in the 90s. Like, after you had a succession of really good artists working on Spider-Man from the 80s up through the 90s. So you had, let me think. You had Eric Larson. You had, oh man, who else worked on him? Oh my God, my mind's slipping on it. But after that, you ended up getting this Clone Saga. I don't know if anyone remembers the Clone Saga. It's when I stopped reading Spider-Man comics. It was like the worst idea for a comic series ever. If you missed one book, you had no idea what was going on. They decided there would be all these Spider-Man clones, and eventually they finally killed off all the clones and like ended the Clone Saga of Spider-Man. But it was this long period of like, what are Spider-Man comics about? Because through the 80s and 90s, he'd been like fighting Venom and going on these different adventures and fighting these high stakes battles against these villains that people were really interested in. Standard stuff that, Stan Lee had established back in the 60s, just on a bigger scale, 6-book series rather than 1 book at a time, which was the standard in the 60s. To like I don't know how long it lasted, like 3-year soap opera. I don't even remember how it ended. Yeah.
Yeah. No one does. That was when
Mark Bagley, Todd McFarlane. There's one more that I'm thinking. Yeah, Mark Bagley. I have a couple of his books still around. They're great. And he also did the first Venom comics as well, and they are also like really well done.
They are.
Sorry, I was just
no.
Yeah, Todd McFarlane did Spider-Man after Eric Larson. I think it was under him that they did the Black Spider-Man, the Black Suit Spider-Man, and then introduced Venom. And then Jim Bagley did it in the early 90s, and then he did that first run of the Venom Lethal Protector books, which were really cool.
Those were good.
So if people want like a good thing to emulate for the introduction of a hero type story, just look at the initial run of Venom Lethal Protector. Like, they do it by the book. I've seen it copied more times than I can count. In fact, I've seen it copied by certain indie comic creators that I'm not going to call out here, like almost copying it panel for panel, what they did in that one. But you basically start by introducing the character doing something. In this case, it's Venom jumping in to save a woman from being like robbed or raped or something. And then you have a little twist that just gives you a hint of what the hero is actually about. And it's Venom, instead of just like tying up the bad guy to be caught by the police, he kills him. He like shoves his suit into his eyes and nose and kills the guy. And I actually saw this copied almost panel for panel by an indie comic guy a couple of years ago who actually used to work for Marvel. So it's such a standard way to introduce it, and you could play with it so many different ways. But if you want a really easy way to have a format for introducing a character and doing character kind of exposition, do that. You start by showing the character doing something. Don't show him don't like explain to the audience something about him. Show him doing something. Then you begin the actual story. George Lucas would do this in movies too. Like you have that, there's always that first section of the Indiana Jones movie that's just Indy doing something. Then the story begins.
Yeah, it's kind of famous as like the James Bond prologue, which I'm pretty sure is where Spielberg got it.
Yeah. So they did it in James Bond movies. I wonder what like Patient Zero was for that. If we went far enough back, it's probably a Western. Like it's in Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You show characters doing stuff before the actual story begins, or for a few dollars more. I think you see even in the spaghetti westerns you have that because you want to introduce the characters. You want people to get attached to the characters before you drop them into the plot. So you're leading with the characters.
Yeah, and especially in comics, what have we heard John Delarose say is that like page 1, panel 1. You want to open with some kind of action. Like you want an action shot of the main character doing something.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. And you can use that in novels too. That you begin with a do, like an action, something happening that gets people invested in figuring out, why they want to root for someone. It's also in like this screenwriting manual, which I need to do some content on, called Save the Cat. He recommends doing it. I mean, you can do it in a really cheesy way, which is to literally have a character save a cat. But it's the same idea. You start with the character doing something that the audience appreciates them doing and therefore will like them, and then begin the actual story. Something that does a little bit of character exposition. They did it in Tron Legacy. Speaking of retro stuff, Tron Legacy has the main character, who's this kid. He goes and releases the operating system for free on the internet or something like that, kind of showing people his morals and what he's willing to do, and kind of who are sort of the bad guys in the setup, although it ends up being something else entirely by the time you get into the actual story. It's more about introducing that character.
Yeah, and I think they use it in a literal sense not at the beginning of the Richard Donner Superman, but kind of in the same place because you've got the origin story tacked on. So the scene where Soup saves a cat from a tree is near the beginning of his career as a hero in Metropolis, which is really where the comic book action story picks up in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. What else has that? There's a lot of ones that have that. They've used it in a lot of comic book movies as well. You don't start with the actual story. You have like a little prologue where Thor's killing dark elves or something like that before you introduce the actual conflict. You don't have to do things that way, by the way, because like Brian and I get talking about this kind of stuff. These are all options for you as an artist. They're tools you can use. George Lucas, of course, begins Star Wars with the plot. It always is starting with the plot. That's what that big crawl is. Here's what you need to know about the story. Now it shall begin. That's the plot. Here we go.
Yeah. Oh, and lest we forget, the script for the Richard Donner Superman movies, written by Mario Puzo, wrote the novel and the screenplay for The Godfather.
Yep.
So, funny story about him. When he was commissioned to write the screenplay for his own novel, The Godfather, he had never written a screenplay before and just kind of brute forced his way through it and ended up winning an Oscar. So after he did that, and it was time for his next project, he thought, okay, well, I better buckle down and study and just learn how to write a screenplay. How to write screenplays. And like page 1, chapter 1 said, watch The Godfather by Mario Puzo.
That's funny. It actually reminds me of an anecdote from Stephen King. He's like, I bought this book on how to write screenplays, like this screenwriting manual, and it was bullshit. But it had an example screenplay at the end, and that wasn't bullshit, and that taught me how to format. my screenplay so that I could actually have it produced. So
That's super important.
yeah. So nowadays, by the way, anybody who's wanting to produce a screenplay, like the industry standard software is the software called Final Draft that's not really used for anything else. The value of Final Draft is that it formats the screenplay for you. That you can really easily, it puts everything, does all the indentations correctly. It's a great piece of software only for that reason if you're going to be making screenplays. Maybe to a lesser extent like comic scripts, but most people don't bother to format comic scripts. Apparently, who am I thinking of? The guy who did the Watchmen. Big hairy guy. Yeah, he did. He would just not even format it. It was just like a wall of text, and then the artist had to turn it into a comic book.
Yeah, that's something we should probably get into for your audience, is how to format various kinds of manuscripts for submission, because every medium has its own weird rules, and like you just said. So on the spectrum of super strict to super loose, Hollywood is the strictest. Like, agents and producers will find any excuse to circular file your script, so it's got to be formatted exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had
comics, they don't care.
I had a guy come back and be like, "We had a screenplay," and he's like, "I think it's formatted slightly weird." He's like, "What template did you use to format this on Final Draft? Because it's weird, right?" And it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, it looks like every other screenplay to me. It's like, we click this one. It's like, oh, you need to click this one, or no one's ever going to look at this again. And here's what it did. It added half a page to the script. It made the script a half a page longer, but he could tell somehow something was off about the way that it was formatted, that it made it unacceptable. It was like, wow.
It's got to be 120 pages, right? Because it's like, what the rule is, 1 minute of screen time per page. I think that's it.
Yeah. So yeah, each page roughly is 1 minute of screen time. So 105 page screenplay is going to be between 100 and 110 minutes, which is an ideal length for a movie for most genres. And you could tell right away. I remember handing a script to Paul Allen, a producer, and the first thing he did was flip to the back to see how many pages it was. And then he patted it and put it in his bag. And I said, "What'd you do there?" And he goes, "I wanted to see if it was the right length, because if it's the wrong length, there's no reason to read it."
So we can't. Job.
Yeah. Like, okay. Yeah, it makes sense. It has to be, you're not making a 200-minute comedy. Not happening. It needs to be 100 minutes. 105 minutes. That's the length of a comedy. Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, the only guy who can break these rules in Hollywood is Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah.
He's become fond of writing his title pages in crayon.
Yeah, I've heard stuff like that. Well, you earn that right after a while. Same thing with James Cameron, right? Like, James Cameron actually breaks a lot of Hollywood rules, even rules that are based on things that James Cameron did. James Cameron will break them and be like, well, this movie's longer, or it has a weird third act. George Lucas did the same thing. You can earn that right if you are big enough. George Lucas routinely broke every rule of screenwriting. Every George Lucas film has like some rule that he breaks, probably intentionally, because he wants a certain effect for it. So like Star Wars begins with this crawl. Movies don't begin with like a big exposition thing. That's retarded, except it became the biggest movie ever, and he did the same thing actually with episode 3. Episode 3 was very outside the normal timing of a Hollywood movie, and I wonder if that affects how people experience it in a negative way. Like, it feels off. Same thing with episode 1. The pacing feels off from what you're used to with a normal movie, because it's not a normal movie. It's completely all of its beat points are different, and it doesn't stick to the Save the Cat format at all. It does completely different weird things. Like, I remember somebody having a criticism about episode 1 is like, there's no protagonist. I'm like, well, Qui-Gon Jinn is the protagonist because he's in every scene and he's doing all the pro-tagging, right? Like, he's the guy doing all the stuff. Why isn't he the protagonist? But it's like, but there's all these other important characters. It's like, can you not have a lot of important characters that are each doing things? I don't know. Seems a little odd.
Since you asked and chat is talking about it, and I watched your recent video wherein you gave a rousing defense of the prequels.
Yeah.
I want to give a counterpoint, and yes, I agree with Benny Berghoff in chat. Prequels are bad. I will die on that hill. They're not as bad as the sequels. And they're they get better. Here's my main silver bullet argument against episode 1, and I've never heard anyone come up with a comeback for this. You ready? It has no reason to exist, narratively. You could cut Phantom Menace and just have the other two, and they make perfect sense, and really, Attack of the Clones is where everyone was expecting the prequel series to begin.
To really begin, yeah. Yeah, and that's and when we watch Attack of the Clones, we get all the information we really need about Anakin, and even when he goes back to Tatooine, we get what he's doing. Like, we don't actually need episode 1 to prepare us for that event either. So I feel like that's such a good point. I think the only thing that maybe is, and that's not even, it begins with Senator Amidala like almost dying, right, and begins this murder mystery kind of thing. It's a mystery plot format. I'm actually kind of I'm a fan of Attack of the Clones more than almost anyone that I've met. I think I like it more than virtually anybody, even the people who like the prequels, because it has that mystery plot format and it's so weird, and like the aesthetics are so all over the place. I just find it such a compelling movie to watch, even with like the romance, which I think is not good. I'll just be honest. Like, they feel like, a couple of dead fish floundering at each other. It really is a dark part of the movie as far as its quality goes. And I think someone on Twitter said, he goes, the problem wasn't that the romance was unrealistic. It's that it was too realistic. It's like two awkward people saying awkward things to each other, trying to be romantic, not able to express their feelings. I'm like, yeah, that's more like real life, isn't it? We have trouble saying how we feel sometimes, and we don't say things in a movie thing. But I'm like, well, but the thing is, it's a movie, and I don't want realism from a movie. I want quality, Yeah,
that's fair. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say about episode 3 is that it actually has a really weird plot format. It has a 4-act plot, which you almost never see in movies. Movies always have this 3-act thing where there's this event, then this event, then this event, then the climax begins, and then it ends. You have that. You have 3 acts, and then all the Jedi get murdered, and you have an extra act. And it's like, it feels so weird when you're watching it. If there's like an awkward feeling to that transition, that's the best way I can describe it. Like it's been set up correctly, but it transitions into this strange 4th act that is just different from any other movie that I think I've seen.
Well, they had to do that way to catch up with continuity and segue into episode 4.
Yeah.
So it's
so weird.
It's kind of got 2 epilogues.
Yeah, that's true. It does have 2 epilogues. That's a good way of putting it. And thinking of like of how episode 1 isn't necessary for the story. I had always imagined that they would basically start with episode 2. What we really needed was like an episode 2, then another movie that includes half of episode 3, and then a longer episode 3 where Darth Vader kills all the Jedi, which is what they said he did in the other movies. For the real continuity to work. I almost feel like when they got to episode 3, and I think that might be the longest one of the prequels, it's like they kind of realized that there was a lot of story they had to cram in there, so they just added an extra act. They didn't try to write a 3-act movie. They're like, nah, we'll have the first part of the movie is finishing off this Clone Wars stuff, and then we'll have another movie about Darth Vader. And that's what it was. It's like 2 little movies stuck together.
Yeah, so to sum up my criticism of all 3 really quick, episode 1 has no reason to exist. Episode 2, yes, there is a decent political mystery thriller buried somewhere under there, but the forced and awkward romance, and then the huge, never resolved, dangling plot thread, which is unforgivable. They make a promise to the viewer and never fulfill it, which is, who is Master Sifo Dyas? Never find out. And with three is the best of them from a technical standpoint. I do like how it has a kind of rhyming poetry theme with like Return of the Jedi. But yeah, its main problem is structural, and because they had to make it match up with continuity.
Yeah,
And that's basically it.
yeah. One of these things about Episode 3 is like it's one of the best produced movies of all time. The production quality is like off the charts, and even movies that came later with newer technology, with bigger budgets, still can't seem to create something that's as visually precise and beautiful to look at as Episode 3. It's kind of interesting to stop and compare it to like anything in the MCU. The MCU stuff can have great effects, it can have great cinematography, but somehow it's lacking like the sheer production quality of Episode 3. And that's why I say, like, in 100 years, students that are studying the craft are going to look more at the prequels than the original trilogy, just for the production aspects, because they were they stand out so much amongst the noise. They're so different, and like even other things that came after them could never really seem to equal that level of precision. And I think once you have a cultural separation with some of the things that we realize make the romance really awkward, I think some people just won't pick up on how awkward it is, believe it or not. Kind of like how we miss a lot of jokes in Shakespeare without having to stop and think about how people thought about things in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare comedies can be funny, but probably not as funny as people found them when they watched them, when they were current, in 1600 or whenever.
Yeah. I can't disagree. And again, it's going to sound cliche, but why do the Star Wars prequels look so much more visually engaging than like Iron Man Part 19, which is basically what the MCU is? It's because at the end of the day, you've got one guy with a vision against a committee. And they even kind of presage that in Empire when Leia's like, "I'm not a committee." Right?
Yeah.
It's almost like a jab in the eye at Hollywood, like it's not coming.
This is like the and I feel this because this is the creative competition between democracy and monarchy. And for creative decisions, I tend to choose monarchy. Even with the things that I didn't like that George did, if there wasn't an auteur in charge of it, you also wouldn't have gotten the original Star Wars. Like, these things weren't done by committee either, despite the fact that he always wanted to hire really talented people to make the movies. Originally, Episode 1, he was trying to get Steven Spielberg to direct it, and Steven's like, "No, you need to do this because it's your vision, blah, blah, blah." And so he's like, "I don't want to direct it, but I will." George Lucas always wanted to hire like the most talented people to help fulfill his vision, but he didn't, at the end of the day, he was making the creative decisions about it. And that's pretty important versus something that's completely corporate and like, no, it has to fit this. And this person has this part, and we're going to hand it off to this person, and or like what happened with Rogue One. So I would love to see, by the way, a director's cut of Rogue One, because you could kind of tell when you watch it. And I found out this, about 40% of the movie was reshot after they took it away from the director. The director made a movie, the studio went back and by committee changed 40% of the movie. They reshot 40% of the movie to make Rogue One what it was. And it was a mess. Now, Rogue One is a mess of a movie. I think people like it because it evokes a lot of nostalgia, but it's, as far as the story goes, it's a mess. And like what you said, there's no reason for it to exist. It does nothing. It doesn't even provide like a fulfilling and coherent story. It does nothing in the Star Wars universe.
It's like someone filmed a Saturday night WEG Star Wars game from the 90s.
Yeah, I did like the robot in Rogue One. It kind of made me feel for him when he sacrificed himself. That was a good little setup. A lot of the things in the previews weren't in the movies. It's like, I remember this and this from these previews. Why weren't they in the movies? And the reason was the director was just shooting lots of stuff, and they were making the previews before the movie was anywhere close to done. And then they took the movie away and reshot stuff. Darth Vader apparently was not present in the original cut of the movie, except like very in passing. And they just kind of added him into the movie so that fans would get to see Darth Vader. He doesn't do anything in the plot. There's no reason for him to exist there, right? His presence in the movie is completely pointless.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to watch Rogue One a couple of times, and it's not that I couldn't make it all the way through it. It's just I would slip into these weird fugue states that I would snap out of every like 30 minutes or something. Like, wait, what? I'm watching a movie?
Yeah, it's a really...
Where am I here?
I found it a pretty boring movie. My wife thought it was really boring, and she's like, this is like the most boring Star Wars movie I've ever seen. I don't know how they made such a boring movie. I'm like, I don't know. It feels slow. There's action happening, but it seems like none of it really matters, until the very last little bit. So yeah, I think Rogue One is actually like the worst of the Disney movies. I know I'm basically alone in that opinion, but it's just, Rogue One is such a just technically bad movie that it's hard to ignore it for any kind of like peak of my nostalgia. The other movies that they'd come out with by that time had already like murdered my nostalgic feelings for Star Wars at that point. It feels like a collection of cutscenes from like 90s Star Wars video games,
Mm-hmm.
Someone says Rogue One is unwatchable. Solo, same thing. They took it away from the guys who did the Lego movie. I think it was the same guys, and they gave it to Ron Howard. Ron Howard is a really competent director, though, so he pulled probably the best of the Disney movies out of it, and it does have like a coherent plot, and it's kind of Ocean's 11 in space. I don't think that's what people wanted, though. I think people had a different idea of what a Solo movie was going to be.
Because they've been paying attention.
Yeah. Zimamaru says, I hate Rogue One because it validates the fans who think they're smarter than they are, saying an exhaust pipe is unrealistic, even though it completely is. Yeah.
You got a reactor, you got to vent it somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And, the whole point of like it was like, this is not considered a weakness by them because they just don't consider little fighters able to do anything. So they haven't erected their defenses. They erected their defenses against big starships, not against little fighters. We understood all that. We didn't need a whole movie to try to set that up and make it like an intentional flaw he built in so that it could be destroyed. It's like, I'm putting a vent in it so it can be destroyed by someone. It's like, why don't you just sabotage it in a more significant way that'll just make it blow up in 3 months?
Yeah, everybody glosses over how insanely difficult it still was for the rebellion to pull that off. Like, they lost almost an entire fighter wing. Like, only like 2 X-Wings and 1 Y-Wing survive. And it's only because they had, like, chosen one to use the Force. He was able to do it.
Yeah.
It was pretty well defended. They had all kinds of AA guns and fighters.
Yeah.
It was really hard.
And that was that was why that climax worked so well. It's like, okay, it's like we gotta roll 700 times in a row right now. And they did.
Yeah, if you wanna see a quote unquote real world iteration of the Death Star trench run that makes total sense, and they explain exactly why there's an exhaust port. Top Gun Maverick.
Oh yeah.
The whole fighter mission at the end is the trench run.
Intentional flaw. Yeah, intentional flaw. Yet billions still died. Yeah, they'll be able to use it as long as they want till someone figures out how to drop torpedoes down this vent that I purposefully made. It's a silly setup. The setup just doesn't work The movie doesn't need to exist. And I would love to see a director's vision of Rogue One, a director's cut, because I think you might get more of the characters. The characters kind of come off like the A-Team, like 1980s. Like we got the nerd and we got the big guy. You know what I mean? Like it's like a build your team. But we don't really get to know hardly any of them through the movie. And they just are there to die, not really to do a whole lot. I don't know.
We got off on the wrong foot anyway, because as soon as I saw the title, I was like, oh, they're finally adapting the awesome Rogue Squadron novels to the screen. That's what it should have been. Like, how do you name it Rogue One and it's not about Rogue Squadron?
Yeah.
What the hell?
You can also just watch the Dam Busters, which is where George 2 got the trench run from. The trench run in Top Gun Maverick is arguably even better than one in Star Wars. It was more tense, and the use of real fighter jets makes it very real looking. Yeah, that's a cool way of putting it.
It was good.
So I think you had to limit the trench run at the end of Star Wars as well. I mean, you were dealing with the technology at the time, but also like the practical limits of the length of the movie. It's like you couldn't have that trench run go on too long. This is also why I thought the sequels were so bad. Is like Force Awakens was just copying the moments from the first movie and slightly out of place, They had another trench run. They did another this. They had another Death Star. We've seen all that before. In some cases, 2 times.
2 times.
Yeah. Anyway, I realize we have reached 8 o'clock, so we've been going for an hour and a half. We're about out of time. I'm going to link Brian's Indiegogo again for the Burned book. And if there's any more questions, now's the time to ask them. If there's any more you want to say about fun retro stuff, now's the time to talk about it. My 80s guy
guys,
here.
Look, we gave you an hour and a half of solid entertainment.
Yeah.
Okay. Time to pay the check, bingo. So we got super chats, right? Super chat, David. Join our Patreon so you can get into our exclusive Discords, and we've just been giving you the tip of the iceberg here. Get insider writing advice and music advice from pros. I've already had my patrons telling me that they've learned more through our respective Discords in a week than like entire semesters of creative writing classes. Okay.
Yeah. So let me find this here. Okay. Yeah. It's not just join the Discord. I'm on the Discord, so I'm happy to answer questions. Sometimes people post things. I don't always get to read them right away because sometimes things pile up, Anyway, you get free books. So anybody that does mine gets Keith's Prolific Creativity book, which is a really good manual. I think it's good because I wrote it, obviously, but it's a manual for setting up your creative process, basically aligning your priorities in your life so that you can complete your projects on time and under budget. One of the things I learned from talking to lots of prospective writers or people who are new to the craft was their problem was not the technical aspects. In some cases, it was the technical aspects, but those are actually still solved by fixing your process because, as Brian has said before multiple times, you have to get the suck out. You got to write 1,000,000 words before you kind of figure out how to write at all. You just have to practice. So this is really about how to set your life up to practice and also the right mindsets for finishing your project and releasing it and things like that. That's all in this book. So you get that if you join my Discord. This month's free book is Eyes in the Walls. Probably should have done this for October, like the spooky month. But anyway, Eyes in the Walls, which I wrote in November a couple years ago. And this is a fan favorite. People really like the ending of this book because it is kind of breaks some of the rules about plot formatting. We have kind of 3 acts and then we have a conclusion, but then it's not concluded. Something else has to be solved before we could figure out what was really going on with the plot. So you can check that one out. That one's free this month. And I'm leaving last month's book, Water of Awakening, my fantasy book, up for free still. So you can still get that one for free if you join this month. And eventually some of those books will come out and we'll have new ones. So there'll be another book for December and then so on and so forth.
Deal.
All right. So check those out. What AI are you using? This is all Midjourney. Midjourney is just the most convenient one for me to use. It has a really wide range of stuff that it could do without having to mess with it too much. I don't use AI images for a lot of the things that people are trying to use AI images to do, which is to like be highly controlled over what comes out. It's like, I just want the AI to like make a gesture in a certain direction. Like I'd love it for making 80s images or like making a background for something, because it could do that really well. Midjourney really excels at that. If you tell it to make a 1980s guy, you get something like this, and it really looks like your idea, your abstraction, your retrovision of what a 1980s guy would look like the blue and pink jacket and the cool hair and the big aviator glasses. So yeah, that's what I'm using for that. All right, guys. Anything else, Brian, before we say goodnight?
Yeah, so it looks like we do have another question in chat from Maru. Why are so many characters so unlikable these days in entertainment?
Well, that's a hard one to answer. I think, honestly, I'm going to give you my kind of deep opinion, which is just that I think Hollywood's out of touch in the fact that LA is like a foreign country now. Having lived in LA, and it was like a foreign country when I lived in it, I go to it now and it's like these people aren't from the same universe as me. So if you're living and working in LA, you're going to have a complete disconnect from what normal people act like and what they want and how they think. And so are your characters going to end up unlikable as a result? I think so. And I also think there's a constant attempt to insert politics into a lot of the dialogue and the stories for movies, which is going to make certain characters unlikable. Like back in the 90s, if you guys remember, was it Step by Step? They had like the feminist daughter who was always like making silly feminist statements that were like, ha 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 ha. It's like that, but they're serious now. So the characters just come off as unlikable rather than as a foil. You know, rather than as like they have a silly attitude about feminism and they're silly, calling everyone male chauvinist pigs. It's like, you're supposed to like that person. No, it doesn't work that way. You end up disliking them. Oh, thank you for the super chat, Sound Engraver.
Ah, there we go. Yeah, Lisa Simpson immediately came to mind.
Yeah, it was a joke for Lisa to be that way. But now they would be serious about it. They'd be like, no, this is how people actually should think, not... rather than showing the absurd limit of it, they just treat the absurd limit as what it is. One of the reasons comedy is, can you guys hear my cat? Poor guy. He's like, where are you guys? Where is everyone? I'm old. I'm alone. He's an old cat, and he does this sometimes. He walks through the hall like, where is everyone? He's deaf, so he can't hear where you are. So he just like wanders around meowing until he sees you. It's very funny.
So I think I gave a great explanation of why these characters are unlikable now. It's because they may as well be written by space aliens who like only know Earth from our old TV broadcasts, right?
Yeah.
We're just so out of touch. But the implied question is, how do you, as a writer, avoid falling into the same trap? How do you make your characters likable? And I can actually give you a pretty simple answer. So, starting from music, imagine a mixing board, okay? And you've got your levels. So you've got your sliders, right, on each of your characters. And each character has 4 sliders that each controls a different setting. And you have pro tagging. How much does the character take initiative? Right, you go from 1 to let's go Spinal Tap, 1 to 11. Competence. How good is a character at what he does? Is he Inspector Gadget or Wolverine? You've got inherent likability. Just is he a jerk or an affable, gregarious guy? And then finally, you have how much do the other characters, especially characters the reader likes, like this character? And the only thing you really got to be careful with is pushing the sliders all the way up or down, because then you just end up with caricatures.
Mm-hmm.
What you want to do is have at least one of them, like a minimum of 8. That's all you need to basically make readers somewhat invested in and like the character, but but play around depending on the character and his role.
Yeah. So I'll give another answer to that too, as far as like avoiding it. And I hate to say it, but it's like save the cat, which is you show the character doing things that the audience is going to appreciate them doing, that are in tune with those characterizations that you want, right? So being charitable, like being kind to someone, sticking up for someone. So if you have a character who has a strong sense of justice, that's pretty much a likable trait. Now that can get them into trouble, right? So you can set up a lot of great conflicts with that. But you would show the character like being upset, even just being upset about like an injustice that's done against a teacher. Like standing up, or a teacher, like you can imagine students in a classroom. This is the scene I'm imagining, and like a teacher's dumping on this one student, and he stands up and says, "You can't say that to him." And then he goes to the principal's office and suffers for him wanting to be something that's just, right? We've created a little conflict there, but we've shown the audience something about that character that is likable and is in tune with their personality. They're somebody that's concerned about fairness, right? Like fairness is an important thing to them. Then, they can have other things that are flaws or blind sides. They obviously, the flaw there is that they can't decide when it's appropriate to stand up for someone, right? They can't manage the situation. They can't think a little bit more Machiavellian, that they need to be a little bit more Machiavellian. So you can have a scene like that. You have to think about what the character does to show those things that you're thinking of. And if you can have a character do things that the audience likes them doing, then they'll like the character. And I think one of the reasons Hollywood characters tend to be unlikable is they're doing things the audience doesn't like. They're like, well, this character needs to have a flaw, so we'll make him an alcoholic who beats his wife. It's like, that's a villain. So thinking of flaws for characters is like a flaw for a character is like he's naive, or he's a little bit too self-concerned, or he is, he puts his foot in his mouth and says the wrong thing. Those are little flaws. People, I don't know what started this trend with like, we're going to bat for the fences with flaws. We're going to make him an alcoholic. We're going to make Simon Belmont an alcoholic. It's like, the holy Christian warrior who kills vampires is an alcoholic who cusses. Who wrote this? It's like, well, it's somebody who's out of touch with everything. Somebody who's never been to church.
There you go.
Anyway, so that's my thing. So that's what I'd add. Is like, think about what the character does. If the character does something that the audience likes, even though, it's totally cheesy, you could do it cheesy like he saves a cat. But whether it's cheesy or not, that will get the audience to like the character. You have to know what the audience wants a character to do, though. And I think maybe Hollywood has lost sight of that. Well, we want a character we want Captain Marvel to beat a guy up for telling her to smile. That's not likable. That doesn't make you like her, unless you are like a super radical feminist, which I guess some of them are. Yeah, 90s edge hangover.
Sociopathy hangover.
Yeah. A likable Sound Engraver says a likable character is everything, and it's great to make the villain the opposite. Palpatine's a likable villain to me, but I hate Apophis in Stargate SG-1. He's detestable. I want him gone. So you do the opposite with villains. You crank up the slider on some vicious aspect, right? Vices and virtues. You crank up. He's greedy or he's lustful. We'll end up really hating characters that show obtuse amounts of lust or greed, right? Those are the big ones. If somebody has like a lustful appetite to, completely out of balance, it's something that's immediately will make a character like you will hate that character. In fact, all the 80s villains have like lust completely out of bounds. Like they're trying to like rape girls. So it works.
Yeah, that opens a whole can of worms of the slasher genre, which kind of inverts that dynamic, but I don't know if we have time to get into that.
Yeah. All right, guys, that's it for today. Have a great one, and I will see you all next time. Wednesdays are the streams. Next week, I'll do probably another Right stream, and we'll talk about the craft a little bit more. So check out Brian's projects and his Patreon, and I will see you all next time. Thank you for joining me, Brian. Anything else to say before we peace out?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Back the Burn book now. If you like KOTOR meets Elric meets the Silmarillion, check it out. Get it early before anyone else hear me read the first chapter.
All right, sounds good. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for joining us, and we will we'll see you all next time.